G'day, my name's Dev. I'm here inside Fanny Bay Jail on Larrakia country in Darwin at the top end of Australia's Northern Territory. In this episode, I'll discuss the international transportation of British convicts to Australia. From the beginning of our colonisation in 1788 until their transportation was finally banned in 1868, the British Empire would send over 100,000 of their most troubled, vulnerable and rebellious people here to what was then the European equivalent of deep space. This system was cruel and unfair. It essentially enslaved poor people for petty crimes, but it supported the development of the Australian colonies, especially Tasmania and New South Wales, into the modern continental federation we enjoy today. This story begins with the Industrial Revolution in Britain and the masses of poor people it brought into its cities looking for work in the new factories. British policymakers were completely unprepared for this mass migration. It swelled the old neighbourhoods of London and Manchester, Birmingham and Glasgow. They soon became overcrowded, filled with unemployment and flooded with cheap alcohol. Charles Dickens characterised this degenerate urban world in his famous books. These desperate conditions caused an enormous crime wave which the rudimentary criminal justice system was completely unable to handle. Each district had a watchman, but British cities did not have police forces in the modern sense. Virtually all offenders were caught by informers or denounced to the local courts by their victims. To reduce crime, magistrates began enforcing the Bloody Code. Under this extraordinary system of punishments, people found guilty of stealing goods worth over 5 shillings, or about 40 Aussie dollars today, were sentenced to hang, and women found guilty of forgery could actually be sentenced to burn at the stake. British prisons soon became packed with convicts serving long sentences for petty theft. There was no attempt to segregate them by their offences, age or sex, and people with mental disabilities were tossed in with everyone else. These prisons became bizarre and almost medieval spectacles where gentlemen could actually visit and drink beer, solicit prostitutes, or just watch the madness. There were arguments to establish modern penitentiaries, but these were widely seen as American conceptions, and so the barbarous system remained. In desperation, the British government began using decommissioned naval vessels as makeshift prison hulks. Life in these floating dungeons was intolerable. The authorities could not have convicts experiencing anything better than the free citizens of the impoverished neighbourhoods from which many of them came. So the convicts were held in squalor, double-chained and deprived of proper food and sufficient clothing. Hygiene was non-existent and disease spread rapidly. Between 1776 and 1795, approximately 1/3 of the 6,000 convicts held on board these hulks died. This is a similar attrition rate to that suffered by Australian prisoners of war during World War II in Changi prisoner of war camp. These horrendous conditions did little to stop the flow of petty criminals through the local courts and into the prison system. Conventional thinking of the time asserted that crime was hereditary. If you were a criminal, then your children would surely be criminals. So the British government decided to send their criminals far away, to the outer regions of their expanding global empire. They began sending convicts to their American colonies, but after they lost them to the revolutionaries in 1775, they decided a new destination had to be found. They considered Africa, but it seemed too dangerous and expensive, so they began looking further afield to the very edge of the world. In 1770, Captain James Cook charted the east coast of Australia and claimed it as part of the British Empire. His optimistic reports completely disregarded the existence of the first Australians, but convinced British policymakers that the Australian continent was an ideal location for penal settlement. So, on the 26th of January 1788, the first fleet under the command of Captain Arthur Phillip arrived in Sydney Harbour to establish Australia's first known European settlement. It comprised 11 ships and carried about 800 convicts. Today, most of the nation celebrates this date annually as Australia Day. However, it is also a day of mourning for many Indigenous peoples, and the date is currently the subject of a cultural war. Most of Australia's states were established as penal colonies, or at least used convict labour for their development, except for South Australia, which was established by a socially frustrated association of middle-class English visionaries instead. When convicts arrived in Australia, most were either retained by local governments for public works or assigned to frontier settlers as a form of indentured labour. Contrary to popular perceptions, Most convicts did not spend the majority of their time behind bars or in chains. They were more accurately seen as servants or unfree workers than prisoners. If they were well behaved, then they were granted some freedoms. At the end of their sentence, which was usually about 7 years, they were issued a certificate of freedom and were then free to become Australian settlers or return home. However, if they misbehaved, they were sent to terrible places for secondary punishment, like Port Arthur, Macquarie Harbour and Norfolk Island. These places were hellholes, often run by sadists, where convicts were treated very harshly, labouring in cold and wet weather and subjected to severe corporal punishments for minor infractions. Approximately 1 in 7 convicts were women. Between 1788 and 1852, about 24,000 convict women were sent to Australia. The majority of them were convicted of petty theft. Life in the early days of a colonial Australia was very hard. These women faced extreme difficulty in achieving freedom, solvency and respectability. Many convict women were driven to prostitution upon their arrival as a means of survival. Most of these women were young, single and had some sort of a skilled background. Upon arrival, they were housed in female factories where they worked and were assessed for their suitability to integrate into colonial society. The conditions were miserable and socially inappropriate by today's standards, but economic historians see it as a genuine British policy to promote coupling and natalism in the Australian colonies. Some of these convict women would have a huge impact on Australian history, notably as escapists, entrepreneurs and mothers to future prominent Australians, but also as writers who provide us with our only real window into those early mysterious days during the colonisation of southern Australia. It is easy to forget that many of the convicts were people still influenced by the old world views of pre-industrial Europe. They had rituals and superstitions, a prevalence to search for herbal medicines and sacred charms in the Australian bush. So they had strange affinities with Aboriginal ceremonies, dreamtime spirits and bush medicines. However, during the colonisation of southern Australia, British officers soon began using black trackers to hunt down escaped convicts. Black trackers were Aboriginal men with exceptional bush skills, but usually dubious morality, who supported white police. They were used across the continent to guide explorers, capture bushrangers, and most terribly, to facilitate the massacres of Indigenous groups. But I think their initial use as convict hunters may have influenced the abject racism that their descendants would eventually suffer in the regional towns which they came to share with the white descendants of those convicts. For example, in 1965, Aboriginal activists formed the Freedom Ride through country towns in northern New South Wales. They exposed systemic poverty within the Aboriginal communities of those towns and blatant segregation from public spaces controlled by whites. During the 1820s, Britain's brutal criminal justice system finally began to liberalise. The death penalty was increasingly seen as too harsh a penalty for petty theft, and so transportation became a more humane alternative. This caused the number of transported convicts to peak in the 1830s and steadily decline over the following decades as protests against it intensified throughout the growing Australian colonies. Transportation was not formally abolished until 1868. During its 80-year history, about 164,000 convicts were transported to the Australian colonies on board 806 ships. Most came from England and Ireland, but some also came from Britain's global outposts. Indians and French Canadians, Maltese from New Zealand, Chinese from Hong Kong and renegade slaves from Mauritius and the Caribbean. Around 3,600 convicts were political prisoners, mostly Irish Republicans. Some of them and their descendants would go on to influence Australia's federation as a nation in 1901. In many ways, this cruel era has helped shape Australia's modern identity. Today, about 20% of Australians are descended from transported convicts, myself included. This lineage may also explain the tall poppy syndrome, that uniquely Australian phenomenon where successful people are mocked for perceived immodesty. This episode was influenced by the books The Fatal Shore by Robert Hughes and Van Diemen's Land by James Boyce. I highly recommend them both. If you're interested, then please hit the like and subscribe buttons. For the next episode, I'm going to discuss the colonisation of southern Australia. Cheers.